right, so this is going to be part 2 of your of the video series to help you complete the Obamanomics assignment. And so there are going to be several places in which Obama's economic ideology takes deep consideration, or we can imagine takes deep consideration of externalities, right? And so specifically, there's going to be several instances, and you're going to see, where's the first instance? Yes, so I think on page 1, 2, 3, on the third page, right, it talks about some of Obama's priorities, its investments in alternative energy, physical infrastructure, global warming, a consideration of global warming, and an attempt to sort of address global warming and climate change. And sort of the economic models and tools, right, because these are what they really are, they're tools that we can use to think about an ideology that prioritizes addressing these broad range of issues is externalities, externality graphs specifically. Right, so climate change, we're going to be talking about the Paris climate deal next week in class, but climate change has kind of been one of those cleavage issues that the Democratic Party has tried to address, it seems, at least more vigorously than the Republican Party. And so one way that we can think about climate policy or the economics related to climate change is to think about externalities. And specifically, here's a negative production externality graph. And we said an externality is a type of market failure. And market failures are instances in which the market fails to produce the socially optimal quantity and price, right? Or specifically where it fails to produce the point at which the marginal cost of producing something equals the marginal benefit of consuming that good. Right, it fails to produce at that point. And so conventionally, assuming there's no externality, and the definition of an externality is a market failure in which the parties of a transaction aren't able to internalize the costs or benefits of the transaction completely, and in fact, somebody that wasn't a party to the transaction is impacted by the transaction. And so an example of a negative production externality would be a firm that is polluting, that has within its production process and is dumping maybe sludge down a river and killing all sorts of fish, or maybe burning greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Those are classic examples of negative production externalities, right? So climate change obviously can be thought of as sort of a giant externality. And so the demand curve and the supply curve of a market transaction, if there's no externality, the demand curve equals both the private marginal benefit curve and the social marginal benefit curve, and the supply curve equals the private marginal cost curve and the social marginal cost curve. Those things are equal, but in the case of an externality, there's going to be a gap between either the private marginal cost and the social marginal cost, or the private marginal benefit and the social marginal benefit, right? And so we can see that here. The private marginal cost curve equals the supply curve of these group of firms that we can imagine are polluters, and find the intersection with the demand curve. That's the quantity being produced. But we can see the social marginal cost curve, which takes into consideration the marginal damage, that's what MD stands for, associated with this production process, right? Maybe it takes into consideration the economic cost of dumping sludge down a river is higher, is shifted to the left from the private marginal cost curve. Right, so we would see, we'd be able to visualize graphically the socially optimal point of production, which is Q2, which is less than Q1. So we know that from society's perspective, we're overproducing. And this little red triangle pointed towards the socially optimum point of production represents deadweight loss, or market transactions that society would rather not have take place, but nonetheless take place. right? So when you're talking about addressing climate change, the economics, right, sort of the graphical representation of taking on climate change and, maybe instituting regulations or, per unit taxes or a range of different tools that you could use is attempting to shift this private marginal cost curve or close the gap between the private marginal cost curve and the social marginal cost curve, right? Shift it to the left, right? Shift the private marginal cost curve up to the social marginal cost curve. And so essentially get rid of this overproduction, right? Because we have an externality, we have a market failure. We can also think about a range of Obama's policies as essentially considering or attempting to harness the power of externalities or limit the costs associated with externalities. And so maybe harness the benefits but limit the costs. So another type of externality that we can think of is an externality in which the private marginal cost curve is above the social marginal cost curve. And so we can think of that as maybe expenditures or like the production of, I wouldn't say public goods because a road or like infrastructure isn't, like roads are not necessarily not a public good. Public goods have to be non-excludable and non-rivalrous, but that's another story. But infrastructure, I'm thinking like physical infrastructure, but there's currently a debate about what is even infrastructure. Has sort of, if we leave the market alone, we're underproducing, right? Because there are benefits associated with infrastructure, or the way that we can think of it from the supply side perspective is that there is actually a much lower cost curve because there are benefits that other people that are externalized from the market transaction that we're not taking into account of, right? So expanding or investing in roads and bridges and physical infrastructure, maybe in broadband, a range of different expanding connectivity, perhaps even education, making those types of investments come with positive externalities, right? Where the societal marginal cost curve is actually shifted inward from the private marginal cost curve. So we can graphically represent this as underproduction, right? Underproduction of whatever this good or service is, right? So that's one way you can sort of think about Obamanomics with respect to his, in the article, his commitment to infrastructure and educational investments and stuff like that. We can also think of that same idea, right, as a positive consumption externality, right? If you get more education, you're not the only one that is able to internalize the benefits. Those benefits are externalized, right? A more educated workforce is better for the whole economy, it's better for more people. And so we're probably underproducing there. And every time externalities are a market failure, and market failures are instances in which government policy can potentially do good, right? And so we have those kind of graphical tools that we can think about. But now I want us to now articulate Obama's interpretation of these graphs. And Obama would say something along the lines of, important to tackle externalities like climate change and to invest in underproduced goods like infrastructure and education, which will have positive spill over effects into economy, Right, something along those lines would be a good articulation. It's kind of messy. And then finally bring it back to Leonhardt's thesis. Does it support Leonhardt's thesis or not? Well, it definitely seems like his tackling of climate change and sort of the aggressive action that eventually does take place seems to put him, as like government can intervene to positively affect people's lives, right? They should, right? The economics of it, in instances of market failures like this, they should intervene, right? So, left-wing Obama, so far, 2 for 2.